House Democrats will get a look at some of the key underlying evidence from the Mueller report. It's part of an agreement made with the Justice Department Monday, and it puts off a court battle for now.
The document turnover comes on the heels of testimony from former Nixon aide John Dean, who compared the Trump White House to the Nixon administration. Joining us with his take is former U.S. Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. Daschle currently sits on the board of directors at the Center for American Progress, and he recently joined the advisory board for Northern Swan, an investment firm in the international cannabis industry. Senator Daschle, welcome to Rising. So just to get started, there's a lot going on this week. We did a little bit in our intro about the John Dean yesterday, so why don't we get the big business off the table. How are you feeling about President Trump's tenure? The Democrats are wrestling over this question of whether or not to start an impeachment inquiry. Do you think it's a good thing to do or not?
Well, I think it's important that the congressional role of oversight is understood and emphasized. Oversight is an important part of the checks and balances that we built into the Constitution. And I see this as just another extension of that important responsibility. So I think the Democrats are doing the right thing. I don't think it has to be in the context of impeachment per se. It ought to be about getting all the necessary facts and all the information we can about every aspect of all the allegations that are still pending.
Senator, you lived through the Clinton impeachment. Do you think that out on the whole it was a net positive for the country, for the Democratic Party? And do you worry that some of your former colleagues are going down a troubling path? Many of them, Democratic senators who are running for president, have come out for impeachment. And this is a very radical step for the country, and it really is something that your chamber, your former chamber, has a storied history of being very careful with.
Well, I think Nancy Pelosi has got it about right. She says it ought to be on the table, but she's opposed to taking any steps towards impeachment at this point. You're right. I was one of the managers of the impeachment trial in the Senate, and I still recall, in fact, I think we still experience to this day the divisiveness and the dysfunction that came out of that experience. It was an incredibly difficult and polarizing moment for the country. We've only had one other impeachment that went all the way, and then another one, of course, with President Nixon that never reached impeachment. But I think it's really critical for us to recognize the divisiveness, the extraordinary price we would pay. There is absolutely no way a trial on impeachment would bring about a conviction. So I think it's really important to play the role of oversight, to do everything responsible around that role, but we had to hold off on impeachment.
One thing that's very different this year than 1998 is 1998, Bill Clinton went on national television and took responsibility for his misdeeds. The Democrats who then were running for office were able to talk about those misdeeds and kind of excoriate the president for his behavior while demanding that we move on to get on to the nation's business. Do you think that there's any way that Republican senators that you know and you hear about would ever be willing to hold the president accountable in any fashion, including not including impeachment, but in any fashion where they would hold his behavior accountable in a way that many people in the country think that he's violated some norms and traditions and customs, if not the law?
Regrettably, I'd have to say no today. If you look at the past 2 years and our past experience, there's no evidence to suggest that unless you're retiring or unless you're not elected, that you'll do anything that would in any way undermine your relationship with President Trump. He's got an enormous hold and grasp on every Republican elected official, and not only in Congress, but virtually in the country. And so I don't see that changing. It's concerning to me that they could be as obsequious as they are, and I think we've got to be very concerned about the obligations that the Congress has with regard to oversight, and that hasn't been fulfilled in the Senate.
One of the pieces of big news this week, the president has gotten into this back and forth with Mexico, which you've been in for a while, from the USMCA trade deal to where we are today with tariffs for immigration moves. You voted for the North American Free Trade Agreement. What's your feeling about how the administration is handling trade with our allies, and particularly in North America?
I'm very troubled. I strongly supported the NAFTA at that time, still supported today. I supported TPP because I think it's critical for us to be engaged worldwide. And these are vehicles for engagement that are absolutely critical to the United States. So I don't think we've done very well on trade, on international relationships, especially with regard to our close allies, Mexico and Canada.
So, Senator, this ideology, your former colleague Joe Biden is running for president now. He seems to be espousing much of this. He hasn't really come out on whether he's pro-NAFTA or not, defends his vote for the crime bill. He's living much in the politics of the past, while much of the country seems to be moving on to the future. Do you think that it will be troubling for his candidacy? Today, he flip-flopped on China. He said now that it's a threat, as opposed to what he said previously. He flip-flopped on the Hyde Amendment. How do you see the politics of the past colliding with the politics of the future as someone who lived through it yourself?
Well, it is always a challenge, but show me a politician, give me one name of somebody in politics who hasn't had a change of heart around an issue. I certainly have, and I think that's almost to be expected. I think you have to adapt to the times, and I think Joe has attempted to do that. The times are different today than they were when he was first elected and basically when he was a United States Senator. So I think it's important for us to reevaluate things as circumstances change, and that's what he's doing.
How do you think he's doing in the primary?
I think he's doing well. If you look at the polls right now, I should acknowledge that I've indicated to him that I'm going to support him and have. I think he's doing well, but it's not a foregone conclusion that he'll win. He's got a lot of work to do, as any candidate would this early in the process.
Are you worried at all about the process of how the campaign is handling some of these things? His schedule doesn't seem to be very heavy. The back and forth over the Hyde Amendment just seemed to be like a little sloppy around the edges with the staff work and the candidate being on the same page.
Well, there are going to be glitches. I can't think of any campaign, including all of my own, that were ever perfectly run. There are going to be glitches and unexpected twists and turns. You have to deal with that. I think by and large, if you look at the polls, he's got almost twice as much support as most of the candidates and well ahead of those who are closest to him. So I think he's, at least at this point, I think he's doing it right. And I think we just have to expect glitches as they come.
Well, we should also turn, sir, we've been talking a lot about cannabis on this show, and we'll continue to do so. I actually sat with the Surgeon General last week to discuss the growing use of cannabis in this country, and he warned that the high-potency marijuana actually has a lot of dangers for developing brains and for pregnant mothers. Let's take a listen to what he said.
We're also worried about marijuana use. We know that 1/3 of youth who vape actually report vaping marijuana, and it's a fundamentally different product out there nowadays. Much more potent. It's not the marijuana of your Woodstock days.
Right. How do you reconcile the Surgeon General's warning with your new advocacy for the cannabis industry?
Well, I have to say I'm certainly not as qualified as he is to talk about some of these things, but I would simply say this. We think that there is potential for real medical opportunity here. There is plenty of anecdotal evidence to suggest that the medical applications of cannabis in particular have tremendous opportunities and pose real new hope for many people with certain diseases. We need to do more research. We need to take cannabis off of Schedule I to allow the medical community in particular to free themselves of all the burdens that today exist with regard to the impediments to research. That doesn't mean we don't have regulation. There ought to be a good regulatory structure, but we've got to have that in order to answer the questions that he's raised.
Well, it's interesting. I actually asked the Surgeon General about descheduling. He said he worries that a descheduling would signal to the general population that marijuana is safe to use at all levels. Do you share that concern?
Well, I don't know.
And he did say that medical research is that there's misinformation about the descheduling process, and that the descheduling wouldn't necessarily make it easier or harder to research medically.
First of all, I think we should acknowledge that cannabis has been around for 4,000 years, and it was used widely in this country until the beginning of the 20th century, in fact, into about 1930. It was only since 1930 that we've looked at it as we do today. And then, of course, in the 1970s, in the Nixon administration, it was put onto Schedule I as a temporary measure by John Mitchell. So I think we've got to be concerned about the misinformation, both on the recreational as well as on the medical side. And taking it off of Schedule I to allow us research on both sides, I think would do the country a real service.
Sir, how do we get One thing that concerns me is that the marijuana industry was pretty well-staffed, populated, and entrepreneurially endeavored by a bunch of African-American, Latino people of color around the country. Yet they seem to be boxed out a little bit in the legal cannabis and marijuana industry, if you look at it proportionately. How do we make sure that we don't end up with a new kind of second-class citizenship for a bunch of people who really do know a lot about this industry and how to make it work?
You're absolutely right. You know, one of the least known factors about all of this is how our minorities, both the Hispanic and African American communities, had embraced marijuana before it was illegal, and while it was still very acceptable as a product, both recreationally as well as medically. And then we made it, I think, back in the 30s and 40s, much more of a racial issue than it needed and should have been. And I think that still lingers today.
Jazz cigarettes. Or
Yeah, exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And there's a great, I won't give the title because but there's a really terrific documentary about that I highly recommend. But I think we really have to be careful about the racial implications of how we look at this debate going forward. And we need to be sensitive to that minority history.
So do you support cannabis legalization?
I don't today, no. I think what I do support is descheduling to allow us greater research on all aspects of cannabis going forward.
Well, thank you so much, Senator. We
My
really
pleasure.
appreciate
Thanks for
it.
having me.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.